Hello, everyone. Welcome to another session for Focus Weekly Ethics. We are going to take up from some newspaper articles and discuss them from the point of view of ethics, integrity, and aptitude. The first article we are going to discuss is this: Ukraine agrees to a 30-day ceasefire with Russia during talks with senior US officials. Let's look at this article from the point of view of theories of ethics. We'll analyze the article first from the point of view of just war theory and peace negotiations. Jus ad bellum and jus post bellum. There are two theories of justice which we discuss in the context of war. The more popular, and that we have done in the previous session, is the theory of justice in going to war. And the other, less popular but equally important, is the theory of justice after the war, meaning the theory of ending the war. And it seems like we are reaching to that stage between Russia and Ukraine because of the push given by US that it becomes increasingly important to discuss the theory of stopping the war. The first one we have discussed earlier. I'll quickly get you through this. The theory of justice with regard to starting the war. What are the things that you have to consider when you have to start it? The first and foremost thing before starting the war is to ensure that this is the war of last resort. Last resort implying all the channels of negotiations have exhausted. You have tried whatever it was available in negotiation channels, in diplomatic channels, and everything has failed. To establish dharma, to establish justice, to establish peace, you are forced to go into war. If this is not satisfied, if any of the 7 conditions spelled out here is not satisfied, then it is not a just war. So it has to be a war of last resort. Secondly, it has to have just intent. You cannot start the war, even as a last resort, with negative, unjust intent. The intent for the war must be defense, or recovery of rights, or punishing the evil, overthrowing the tyrant. These are allowed, but the intention of conquest, the intention of aggression, aggressively conquering the foreign land, like Russia did Crimea in 2014, that is not permissible. War of aggression, war of conquest, in any case, is not permissible. The Nazi invasion of Poland, or the aggression showed by North Korea in the Korean War, that is not permissible. The other criteria for starting the war is that the decision for starting the war has to be taken by legitimate political authority. Legitimate means authority that has will of people, authority rightly voted to power, authority that reflect the aspiration of people. That is legitimate authority. So this is the war call by the local militias, the war call given by Naxalism, the war call given by terrorist organizations. That is not just war. In no case that can be called as just war. To increase the legitimacy, they formed the war cabinet. And in the war cabinet, unlike the usual cabinet, the opposition members are also included to increase the will of people, to increase the legitimacy. When you're starting the war, you cannot make it compulsory. Compulsory military service is not allowed under the just war theory of Thomas Aquinas. Individuals have the right to refuse to fight in an unjust war. In their opinion, if the war is unjust, they have the right to refuse. If you make it compulsory and coerce people, then the war will lose the characteristic of being just. Then when you are into the war, when the war is ongoing, you have to ensure that the force used must be proportional to the injustice suffered. The damage and the loss that you have incurred, you can cause the damage and loss to the enemy in the same proportion. Excessive violence is not permissible, not at all. Disproportionate response is not allowed under the just war theory. Like the bombing of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, that is disproportionate response. The Vietnam War that escalated unnecessarily for 20 years, you got nothing out of it, but you still continued to fight. US continued to fight the poor country Vietnam for 20 years. That is disproportionate response. That is not allowed. During the war, you have to discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. It's always soldier versus soldier. Combatants should not engage with non-combatants. Non-combatant, the civilian area, The civilians must never be targeted in the war. In the ancient time, in the Battle of Panipat and others, it was a designated position. It's an open field at the fixed time and the fixed place. You come, assemble your army, and you fight. You don't go honkering over the civilian areas and destroying the cities. That then the war loses the characteristic of being just. It's always soldier versus soldier. So indiscriminate bombing, as we have heard the news that Russia has done in Ukraine, or Israel uh, has risen over Gaza and grounded it. Many civilian death has happened both in Gaza and Ukraine. That makes the war, that characterizes it as unjust. That should not be done. In modern times, there are technologies, there are precision bombing. You can use the intelligence to target the terrorist camps, the terrorist networks, but you should not have too many civilians' death as collateral to the war. That is not acceptable. For the greater good argument, that is not acceptable. In the just war theory given by Thomas Aquinas. And to continue with the war, when you're ongoing, there must be a reasonable chance of success. Hopeless war is not permissible. One of the hopeless war we discussed, for 20 years, US was fighting in Vietnam. That is a hopeless war. You're not winning. You were not winning in Vietnam. You were not winning in Afghanistan. You were not winning in Iraq. But you're continuing it. Unnecessarily, you're continuing it. That hopeless war, if you see that the chance of success is not there, and if the war is not swift, it is lingering over, then you must come back on the tables and talk. These are the 7 arguments that we have done in the previous sessions more elaborately, but these are the 7 arguments that to keep in mind to start the war. But now the war seems to be ending. So the theory of justice, how to end the war. Let's switch our focus on that. To end the war, you have to look for restorative justice. And any kind of agreement that you get into, whether the kind of agreement you got after World War I or World War II, the Treaty of Versailles of World War I, or the present agreement that Russia and Ukraine is getting into, that should provide the pathway to address territorial violations and compensate for the damages. The newspaper article mentions that days before the talk for agreement has begun and settled, 300 drones of Ukraine has been shot. There's so many destruction, so many lives lost, and so many of the villages have been conquered and destroyed by the Russian forces. The question is, when you are getting into agreement, will the restoration be done? Will you get any kind of compensation for the damages? Or you're going to push the country to the brink and keep them hostage and force them to get into the agreement, as Germany was made to do. And you know what happened after that? You know what happened after that? The first series of war in 20 years, the nation resurrected itself to go for another series of war. So for peace to come, there must be restoration of justice. Then only agreement makes sense. So while you're ending the war, the agreement must be just and something must be done for restoration of justice. Something must be done for reconciliation to build the trust. The situation doesn't linger on as it went on during the Cold War. That agreement must ensure. So there has to be accountability from the side of the two parties and the interlocutor, the negotiator. You have to develop trust, as Nelson Mandela did between the blacks and the whites through his Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And there was no war, but there was kind of subjugation of the blacks through the apartheid practice by the whites in South Africa. And how did the situation went on? South Africa is the only country that has distinct brown population because of matrimonial alliance of the blacks and the whites. How did that happen? The whites were encouraged to seek forgiveness, and the blacks were encouraged to grant forgiveness. So to come out and speak the truth that you did wrong, and only then there can be reconciliation. Otherwise, situation just lingers on. The enmity continues. There's lack of trust, and even if you end the war formally, there will be Cold War going on. So while you're ending the war, it is important that you maintain trust. You ensure accountability of what has gone wrong. You ensure compensations for the territorial violations and the damages. Without that moral accounting of war crimes, you do not restore peace. Peace does not mean absence of war. Peace means presence of justice. That's a quote of Martin Luther King Jr. And unless you do that restorative justice, peace will not be on the table. There's a concept of transitional justice, that the agreement must establish accountability of potential war crimes. And if you brush these issues under the carpet and hope to continue based upon the economic agreements, like Ukraine has been enticed for some mineral exploration agreements and the sales of weapons and the sharing of intelligence by the US, if that is your only consideration and you're not focusing on justice as a concept, then it will be difficult to end the war actually. Another aspect that we have to discuss from the point of view of ethics in international relation in the news is this mediation process and ethics related to mediation. That is important. The role the US is playing in the reconciliation, there are many questions arising out of that. Ethical responsibility of powerful nation. First of all, there will be an ethical question: should the US interfere? And what responsibility the powerful countries have, their moral obligation to facilitate peace globally. This question is important when we come to the very last point. Then we will understand the essence of the first point. As the interlocutor, as the mediator, there's a question of neutrality versus advocacy. And if you're doing advocacy of something, then the question of strategic interest that is there for you arises. As a negotiator, you should be a neutral body. That's how the arbitrator or the judges should behave. But the role of Saudi Arabia has hosted the meetings of the officials of Ukraine and Russia. Of Saudi Arabia is the host, and US as the proposal architect, the main key player in the whole negotiation. And both of them actually have strategic interest. Saudi Arabia has economic and geopolitical interest. It wants a stable energy market. And it also wants to gradually position itself as a diplomatic power, getting close with Russia and balancing its interest with US and Russia, which you must be doing as part of your international relation. US has a clear strategic interest regarding NATO and European security architecture. US is already the security provider of Canada and want that role through NATO for Europe as well. And it has the interest of limiting the Russian influence. So instead of letting Russia win the war, the interest is to end and get into negotiation. The article also mentions of a deal on Ukrainian minerals that Elon Musk also seems to have interest in. And if you're enticing them through these agreements, through the deals with of defense equipments and sharing of promise of sharing of intelligence data, if Ukraine gets into the agreement, then and that raises the question of neutrality versus advocacy of the mediator. That raises the big question of impartiality. When you're coming with these interests, these strategic interests, would you be able to be impartial between the two parties? And so that the thing that we have talked about, this restorative justice through the agreement can happen, or you're advancing your own strategic interest through the agreement. That raises the question of ethics in mediation. Privilege of power. You have the power, of course, you have the best of equipments, and you have the latest strategic data sharing intelligence. There's a question of the privilege that you're having with power and ethics of conditional aid. UPSC has previously asked about the ethics concerning international aid. US is promising aid to Ukraine, but that is on conditions. That is on conditions. Mentioned in the article, the condition is of giving the military aid and intelligence sharing, but on the condition that Ukraine sits on table for talk. So how exactly you're using the power and how are you advancing your own strategic interest through it? That is a big question. Are you really concerned? Do you feel obligated to restore peace in the world? Or do you use your power as privilege to advance your own interest? And in that process, are you respecting the sovereignty concern? To a certain degree, Ukraine will always also have its own reservations, its own concerns. And are you considering those concerns, or are you forcing the nation to get into an agreement? And the final point I have here with regard to ethics and mediation is the question of moral consistency. As the visuals you have seen from the White House, the verbal spat between the president of Ukraine and the president of US, uh, they are clearly pushing him to get into the agreement. The question is, can you do that while maintaining your own military engagement elsewhere? Do you hold that moral authority to force agreement and stop the war on Ukraine when you are raging it in other part of the world? And that really raises the question. I'll bring you back to the first point. Are you doing it out of moral obligation? Or are you doing it out of your strategic interest? The second article that we have for discussion is better performing states are set to be penalized, says Congress. And this, obviously, if you have been reading newspaper, you must have picked the issue of seat allocation in the Lok Sabha, the issue of redefining the constituencies based upon the population. The population data of the use of that of census of 1971 for seat distribution. But now that is set to be revised. If that is set to be revised, states like Uttar Pradesh on that new data will set to gain 11 seats. State like Tamil Nadu will be set to lose 8 seats in the Lok Sabha. And that is creating a fervor. And the southern states are advocating against it. So there are a lot of ethical questions that arises from this issue. This article highlights a fundamental ethical dilemma, whether the states that have successfully implemented the national family planning policies, should they be losing in political representation, the seats in Lok Sabha? Whether the political power should be purely population based or account for policy compliance and social good. The, the concept of representation is based upon population. But the question is, should that be the case? And if that is the case, then that will that not be unjust penalization to the states that have performed well in family planning? States that have fulfilled their social responsibility, they have implemented the policies fairly, should they be losing on fair political representation? That is the core ethical issue. And to discuss the core ethical issue, we can go back to the core concepts of justice and fairness. Justice and fairness has many concepts. Population-based representation that follows a utilitarian approach. One person, one vote, and one MP representing almost the same amount of population, that idea is based upon the utilitarian approach. But preserving representation for states that have followed national directives that reflects a desert-based conception. This desert is not the arid region, or this desert is not the dish after that you have after dinner, the sweet dish. Desert here is from the word deserving. Desert-based conception of justice, or this is also called as principled justice. In this idea, entities should receive what they deserve based upon their actions, their choices, their decisions. And it also has the element of accountability for the choices that you have made. Accountability. And both are equally popular: accountability based justice, or performance based justice, or principled justice, and utilitarian approach to justice. So the ethical question that really becomes is that should state face reduced political influence for actions that benefited the nation? From looking from the justice perspective, there are two options that you can go with. You can go with one person, one vote. You can go with the utilitarian perspective, or you can go with the accountability based approach to justice, the principled justice, or desert based conception to justice. That creates a dilemma. There are other issues of intergenerational ethics and policy incentive. States that have done well, mostly the southern states in family planning, they obviously has made some sacrifice for the future generation. Sacrifices that ought to benefit the future generation. But those sacrifices, they are at the risk of getting nullified if you reduce their political representation. So that creates an ethical tension between democratic principles that popular democratic principle of proportional representation and the recognition of past sacrifices. They'll start getting conflicted. As I told you earlier, in the new scheme with the projected changes, it is estimated that Tamil Nadu will lose 8 seats and UP will gain 11 seats. And this raises the question about the ethical threshold at which disproportionality becomes problematic. Disproportionality in the representation of the seats, and these numbers, they're not minor numbers. They seem to be disproportionate. There's also a question of autonomy versus national objectives and center-state ethical relations. The states can plan their issues differently, and different states were at their independence to have the planning, especially regarding family planning. Many states have done excellently on that, especially Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, other southern states. But many of the states, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, they have not done as much. So, should the states be held accountable for divergent policy choices in our federal system? And if the divergent policy has happened in different states, obviously the one that is leading to social good, that is aligned with the national policy, they should be rewarded. And this is a legitimate concern of the states who have done well, that they are going to be penalized. And that is going to create, again, tension in the federal structure and create questions on central state ethical relations. So, the delimitation that the center is contemplating should be done very cautiously. How can it be done? Well, there are many suggestions coming up so far. One of the suggestions is to revise the delimitation criteria. Delimitation criteria, which is based on population, wholly and solely population. So suggestions which are coming up that has to be again closely scrutinized is to include multiple factors, not just population, but development indicators as well, literacy rate of the state, the healthcare achievements, other goals of SDGs that they have achieved. And overall, that can be used for the representation. It may have some advantage and it may have some pitfalls. It has to be closely analyzed before it can become a serious recommendation. Weighted representation. Implement a system where population is one of the several factors, not the sole determinant. So population growth, like for example, finance commission, as you have done, the 14th and 15th finance commission, they have different criterias. And 15th finance commission created this change from the 14th finance commission of including population. But if you see the criteria, it's not just the population that is the criteria for the state to get the distribution from the tax proceed. But there are other criteria. So this is a rich criteria. If you go through the criteria of 15th Finance Commission, with population, but also forest cover and the income gap, other things. So weighted representation, you can have 3, 4, 5 parameters with different weightage to calculate the representation in Lok Sabha. But right now it is based upon population only. Or the other suggestions, you can have some compensatory measures. As you had for GST, states were initially not willing to come on the common platform of GST, but they were given compensation and they were given assurance that in case of loss of revenue for 3 years, you'll be compensated. So some kind of financial incentive or some kind of enhanced autonomy with regard to decisions if the state is set to lose the seat. That could be done. You can have staggered implementation. Gradually, you can implement it in phases to adjust and to minimize a sudden disruption. Or in the process, as you did for GST, intensive negotiations were done. Intensive slogans were made. GST was projected as good and simple tax, and the benefits were made known to people to develop consensus. And that kind of approach through persuasion, if you're going to have that kind of disruptive change, it must happen gradually. And through persuasion, you should try to develop consensus. You must also look into the legal and constitutional aspect of it. Setting limits on the number of seats in any state that can gain or lose will create the constitutional question if that is permissible and if that is the right and balanced approach to delimitation. If the question of the human rights and the question of political rights are associated with it, then you can seek a judicial review under the provision of the Constitution from the Supreme Court. as to see if that delimitation process adheres to the principles of fairness and equity. The process must not violate the constitutional rights of citizens. And if you toe your line carefully through consultation, through deliberation, through creating awareness, then definitely you will reach to some consensus and some methodology, some roadmap, some right approach where people agree to, as you did for national education policy, as you did for GST. For that, you require advocacy groups. For that, you require public awareness. Ultimately, the objective of the state should be aligned with sustainable development goals. Sustainable development. And for that, you have to align delimitation and representation policies with broader sustainable development goals. So, one policy measure should be aligned with other policy measures so that we are targeting sustainable development. And in gaining in some areas, we should not be losing in other areas. The third article that I'm going to discuss with you today, this new forms of punishment in Madhya Pradesh. There have been many instances coming out from the state that police is parading the accused while they have been taken to courts. And they are also beaten up in the way to the court. They all often seems lingering and walking the accused. The video also are made that's uploaded on the social media. The mainstream media also picks up on those news, but they mostly broadcast it rather than scrutinizing it. It has been observed that police officers are garlanded by some of the groups for such measures that they take. Now, this new form of punishment, earlier it was raising down the houses using bulldozer, but Supreme Court has, in quote unquote, given binding orders to all the states to not do that. So that has stopped. But giving punishment outside the code of law, that has been observed in many states, and this article has highlighted some of the instances from the state of Madhya Pradesh. So, in an objective manner, we have to see the ethical issues which are in these cases and the possible solution to those ethical issues. The most basic need of a man is dignity. Dignity is most basic. It is not, it is inviolable. It cannot be compromised. And dignity, even of the accused, dignity, even of people whose crime have been proven, that cannot be violated. Right to life and dignity, Article 21, cannot be suspended in any condition. So, the most basic ethical question with regard to this is raised on the issue of rights. And the most fundamental right of a man is right to life with dignity. So, regardless whether they have been incriminated by the law or not, regardless of that, dignity has to be maintained. The process of law enforcement must keep intact respect. That is the first thing. If you do that outside the code of law and you do it in that manner, public disgrace, that takes away the dignity. There are many questions in the issue. Ethical question of rule of law. Rule of law implies that the law must be enforced in an impartial way following the due process. You understand, you must have done that in polity as well, that we follow the legal jurisprudence of the due process, not the procedure established by the law, but the due process of the law. And public humiliation and extrajudicial punishment bypasses the legal procedures that violate the principle of natural justice, that violate the procedure, the principle of due process. So that can lead to miscarriage of justice because the accused has not been presented to the court yet. And the court has not passed the judgment yet. So he is still accused. The question of police accountability is a significant issue of police accountability because in law, the police has no such power. And there's lack of immediate condemnation from higher authorities that exacerbate the problem. In many of the instances, the statement of the SP is actually to defend such a thing rather than raising questions. The role of media, as I'll have in the list as well, which is also not very encouraging. The public perception and mob justice, the cheering and support from the bystanders, and they cover it, they post it on the social media. The local media also picks it up. That reflects a dangerous downtrend towards mob justice. That's against rule of law. That's against any theory of justice. That's against the stability in society. In earlier times, when rule of law was not there, jiski lati uski bhas, this was the theory of justice prevailing. Justice was the interest of the strong. There, you shave off the head of people. And article also discusses towards the end that for certain things, you did do public disgrace. Like, for example, adultery, the people were publicly disgraced in the medieval times, in the ancient times, where the rights theory were not developed, where the fundamental rights were not guaranteed, where the constitutional morality was not established, where the principle of accountability was not there, where human dignity was not given value. There you could do it. But that was a barbaric culture. Society was not very effective with regard to protection of human rights. So that sign is a dangerous sign. It's a sign of degradation in society. Any extrajudicial action must not be acceptable. And justice delivery should be happening through due process, through the judicial proceedings. There is a question of loss of reputation to the families and emotional traumas to the families because of the videos being posted on social media that, of course, impact the families, and they should not be punished in the whole process. But when you do things like that, then they are brought into the realm of punishment, and that should not be allowed. There's a question of ethical leadership, the silence, the implicit support from the local politicians. Local MLAs, most of the times, are very active in such kind of instances, and through their support and through the other bodies, many times vigilant bodies, such actions are carried out. It raises question about ethical leadership. It raises questions of moral responsibility to ensure law enforcement. It raises the question on your duty to act as the custodian of the Constitution and guardian of the legal procedures. There's a question of community and social ethics. These kind of actions reflects a broader societal issues where certain behaviors are deemed unacceptable based upon the public sentiment, and then they are punished based upon public sentiment rather than legal or ethical standards. This will create problems because it will create problem in many senses, but it will destroy the social cohesion. One of the reason it is said that why only the state has monopoly for violence. State can do lathi charge, state can do firing sometimes in the air, state can give you the punishment for death penalty. Death, that is given only by the state. One of the reason that we find in philosophy in support of that, why should only state have monopoly for violence, is that you should not taste violence. Number one, you should not get into the habit of violence. And number two, if you don't do it yourself, then there will be no grudge against you in society. Relations, fraternity, brotherhood, cohesion can still be maintained. But when you take the law in your hand and when you become violent, and that becomes on the level of community, on the level of social groups, ethnic groups, that will destroy the moral fabric of the nation. If the state punishes few people from one religion or one caste or one ethnicity or one linguistic group, there's no problem, there's no enmity among the groups if the state does it. If people do it themselves, then there is a question of destruction of social cohesion. That should not be done. There's a question of media responsibility. Local media, and sometimes the case escalate, then the national media, they show the recordings and they do the job of dissemination of these videos. That does a compounding effect. They do sensationalization of the issue. Instead of scrutinizing this issue, instead of questioning, instead of enforcing accountability, they do sensationalization. They do dissemination of those videos, and they do the compounding effect on such issues. So the role of media, the media ethics is in question in such issues. Judicial oversight. Supreme Court has given the directive with regard to not taking the law into the hand by municipalities, not grazing down the houses. Supreme Court has given directives against bulldozer justice. But on these issues, there seemed to be a lack of judicial oversight, and there seemed to be lack of ethical leadership. These things are done without any enforcement of accountability. So it calls for a judicial oversight to ensure that the law enforcement agencies adhere to the constitutional and legal standards. But right now, it seems to be missing. That judicial activism or that judicial review on such a thing, that so moto action that Supreme Court took in case of judicial of bulldozer justices, that seemed to be missing right now. And then the article discusses towards the end the cultural and historical context. And it says that the communities in those regions and in different parts of the country historically have led has dealt with and has used community-led shaming practices in cases of adulteries, maybe some kind for thieves, etc. And to overcome this practice, the root cause and the historical context must be understood, as such a practice has been there in society for different things since the past. And hence it need to be addressed, and people must be made aware of the downside of this. Only then, from the root, the problem can be solved. Some of the suggestions for stopping such a thing is to strengthen the legal frameworks. Punishment must be swift so that people do not feel that the justice is not getting delivered, and punishment, which is extrajudicial, must not be allowed. Due process, natural justice principle must be enforced, embedded in the legal frameworks. Training of the police officers. Supreme Court recently has scolded the filing of FIR against one of the MP from Uttar Pradesh. And they have said that the police, this is a statement of Supreme Court, the police need to understand the freedom of speech and expression and not work against it. If anybody has said something, somebody has wrote a poem, somebody has posted something, somebody has made a show, you should not be curtailing it unnecessarily, filing FIR on them. So the training of police officers is very important to sensitize them so that they understand the importance of Article 21, the importance of Article 14. They understand their roles and responsibilities. Change within will have to be necessary to reflect any change without. There has to be accountability mechanisms, establish robust mechanisms for holding public officers accountable. And that will not be only done by the courts, that should be done through the system, that should be done through police reform, that should be done through the DGP office, that should be done through reports and fact finding by the SP office. It has to be there. And if it is not there, and as blatantly as it is happening, we are on the downturn of social morality. And people do not realize that this will cause degeneration of ethics in society that will have long-term impact. People should be aware. Case studies of people taking the laws in their own hand must be popularized. People must be made to understand the downslide of it. They must be made to understand that when people took the laws in hand in Myanmar, in Sri Lanka, in Syria, in Afghanistan, now currently in Bangladesh, earlier in Pakistan, what happens? What happens? You have to educate people on them. That is why Gandhi was so wise to not allow that in India, and he called off the non-cooperation movement the moment he sensed that people are taking the law in their own hand and have become violent in the Chori Chora incident. A media has to have a great role to play. It is considered as the fourth pillar in democracy. And whenever there's vacuum, the executive vacuum or the legislative vacuum or the judicial vacuum, that has to be filled by media. That seems to be a weakening in the current times in terms of not enforcing accountability and asking questions to authority. So their reporting is very important of such incidents. And when they report it, they should not just act as a broadcaster of such videos and visuals. They must act as the custodian of the rights of the people, and they must act as the advocacy group for enforcing human rights. These are the solutions, which seems obviously difficult, but there is none other than this. It has to be done, otherwise we are on a downward spiral of morality.